Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. Get updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen at david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the one advisory that we do have out for the area. This is a wind advisory out for the lower Yukon Valley. That is valid now until 10 p.m. this evening, and that is going to be for southeast winds that are 20 to 30 miles per hour sustained, with gusts as high as 45 miles per hour. Again, that's in the lower Yukon Valley and valid until 10 p.m. this evening. So yesterday we did talk about some of the climate with some of the rain and temperatures in southeast Alaska. This is a follow-up to that. This is looking out ahead for the month of October, what we're expecting climatologically in terms of how much precipitation we'll see in the southeast. So what you can see here is that pretty much all of the panhandle is in that green shade, meaning that there is chances to see above normal amounts of precipitation. Now this is going to of course vary by area. Some places like Juneau for the month of October average 8.63 inches, whereas Sitka is up to 12.95 inches and Ketchikan is at 19.22 inches. So for each of these places, they are expected to see above the normal amount of precipitation. So Juneau would see more than 8.63 inches, whereas Ketchikan would be expected to see 19.22 inches. And again, this is for totals for the month of October. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we have a low out over the northern part of the Bering Sea, and you can see a frontal system pushing into the west coast of the state, bringing some cloud cover and rain to the west coast of Alaska. That front is going to drape through Kodiak Island area with a trailing edge further to the south of the Alaska Peninsula. Behind this system you can see some of the showers out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. And then out ahead of this system altogether in the portions of the Gulf, you can see an area where some of the high-level clouds are cleared out. We have some ridging out over that area that's extending weakly in over the Panhandle area. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we do see that low up by the St. Lawrence Island area with that front extending in the west coast, bringing in rain throughout the west coast of Alaska from the Kotzebue Sound area down through Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula, and even out by Kodiak Island. Behind that front, we're seeing some showers out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, and this does include the Pribilof Islands. Out ahead of this front, some of the southerly winds are coming in and bringing in some more moisture to the south central area. Heaviest precipitation is going to be along the North Gulf Coast and in Prince William Sound area, where we are going to see some snow at the higher elevations in those coastal ranges, but most of the low-lying areas should be rain. As we look out towards the Yakutat area, some lighter rain is expected, but then that weak ridging extending out over the Panhandle area should keep most of the Panhandle fairly dry for the remainder of today. Out over the interior, some lighter areas, a mix of rain and snow, where the low-lying areas are going to expect to see more rain. Higher elevations expecting to see snow, and as we get into the Brooks Range, we'll see more snow there. Up along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see areas of fog. So moving to tonight, going to continue to see fog along the Arctic coastline, but you'll notice now that our front has started to really break up and a new low is formed off the old boundary near Kodiak Island. That's going to bring that front into the western portions of the Gulf of Alaska, continuing to bring rain throughout the Kodiak Island area, out through all of the west coast of the state, now extending up to the Point Hope area. And our low sitting out over the northern Bering, just spinning in place now, continuing to bring showers throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. Out ahead of our front in the Gulf of Alaska, continued southerly flow going to bring more rain to the North Gulf Coast with some areas of snow in the higher elevations. That rain is now going to extend more steadily out towards the Yakutat area, and then out over the Panhandle. High pressure is going to dominate most of the area, where we'll see some fog develop overnight tonight. Then in the interior portions of the state, primarily dry until we get way out to the western locations, out by our southerly winds with the rain. As we move into Thursday, some showers are going to pop up out over the Brooks Range, going to be snow, and then more fog is expected along the Arctic coastline. Down for the west coast of the state, going to see rain from the Seward Peninsula area down to the Bristol Bay area. And our low pressure system out by Kodiak Island now extending the front further out into the Gulf, which is going to push that rain further to the east, bringing rain to central and northern locations of the Panhandle. As we get further to the north near Haines, we will start to see a mix of rain and snow, especially as we get to the higher elevations. Continued rain along the North Gulf Coast and low-lying areas of south central Alaska, and then more rain throughout the Bristol Bay area and out through the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with the westerly flows circulating around our low out over the northern portions of the Bering Sea. As we move into Friday, that low is continuing to weaken and push off slowly to the south and west. Then we're going to have our frontal system pushing out towards the eastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing rain throughout the Panhandle area and all along the North Gulf Coast and other areas around south central Alaska. More rain for Kodiak Island, the Bristol Bay area, but we are going to start to see diminishing rain as we move further to the north. The YK Delta through the Kotzebue Sound area should be dry on Friday, as well as much of the interior, but we'll still see areas of lingering fog up along the north slope. Down in the Bering Sea, we're going to have the westerly winds continuing to bring rain showers throughout the Bering Sea, Pribilof Islands, and for the Aleutian Islands. Taking a look at our temperatures, dropping down for those lows for Thursday morning. Out for the Aleutian Islands, down into the lower to mid 40s are expected, 44 at St. Paul, into the mid 40s to lower 40s as we move through the Alaska Peninsula and into southwest Alaska. Getting colder as we get further to the north, around 40 degrees for the Norton Sound area, in the mid to upper 30s for the Kotzebue Sound. Meanwhile, Gamble's going to drop down to 41 degrees. Along the Arctic coastline, dropping down into the 20s, with 24 through the pass and at Arctic Village. Down in the interior, we're going to have temperatures dropping just above freezing into the mid 30s. As we move further to the east, dropping down into the 20s. And then down in the south central area, interior locations dropping down into the 30s, but areas nearest to the water are going to stay in the low 40s. Down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down into the upper 30s to near 40. And then as we move into Thursday afternoon, staying in the Panhandle area in the 50s for southern locations, into the upper 40s as we move further to the north. 50s for much of south central Alaska, in the Copper River Basin dropping down to the mid 40s as well as at Valdez. And then as we look up into the interior, temperatures dropping down to the 40s for central and eastern locations, as well as some of the areas further out west, getting into the upper 40s there. Down around 50 degrees for much of the southwestern portions of the state. Seward Peninsula area, mid 40s are expected, and then right around freezing for those afternoon highs on Thursday for the Arctic coastline. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, upper 40s are expected, and then upper 40s to near 50 for the Aleutian Islands and Pribilofs. Friday morning lows going to drop down to right around 40 degrees throughout the Bering and Aleutian Islands, right around 40 degrees for the southwestern portions of the state, but as we push into the interior, dropping down into the lower 30s, and then near freezing for much of the interior as we move into the central areas, and then in the 20s as we get to eastern portions of the interior. Out by the Seward Peninsula area, dropping down into the mid to upper 30s, and then right around 30 degrees for much of the Arctic coastline. Down in south central Alaska, dropping down into the low 40s for interior locations, into the 30s. And then for the Panhandle area, near 40 for northern locations, but as we get further to the south and closer to the Gulf, dropping down into the lower 40s. For our afternoon highs for Friday, getting up to around 50 degrees for the Panhandle area, and in the lower 50s for much of south central Alaska, into the mid to upper 40s for much of the central and eastern interior, as well as pushing out towards the west, including the Seward Peninsula area, down around 50 or up to 50 degrees for afternoon highs for southwest Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula, up to near 40 to upper 40s, or near 50 to upper 40s for the Aleutian Islands, and right around freezing for the Arctic coastline.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for aviation. We'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, our old low up in the northern portion of the Bering is bringing some IFR conditions throughout much of the northern and eastern portions of the Bering Sea, but becoming more VFR as we get closer towards the central and western Aleutian Islands. Out through the Gulf of Alaska, the new low is going to bring some IFR conditions out to much of the northern portions of the Gulf and out towards the central and northern portions of the Panhandle as well. MVFR conditions through much of the rest of south central, especially at higher elevations, with some areas at low-lying areas going to have VFR conditions. In the interior, a mixture of VFR and MVFR is expected, and then as we get closer towards the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, MVFR and IFR conditions are expected. Moving into Thursday afternoon, going to continue to see IFR conditions along the Arctic coastline, primarily VFR with some areas of MVFR in the interior. Then the same down in the south central area as well. As we get into the Gulf of Alaska, primarily IFR conditions till we get out by the Panhandle area where we will see mainly MVFR. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, northern and eastern locations going to see more IFR, and then improving to VFR by the western Aleutian Islands. Friday morning, primarily MVFR throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians until we get up into the northern locations where we'll see some more IFR. IFR also out over the southwest coastline, including the Bristol Bay area, and then some areas of MVFR and IFR throughout the Gulf of Alaska, with IFR through Prince William Sound area extending along the North Gulf Coast towards Yakutat, and then MVFR conditions for the Panhandle. South Central Alaska and the interior, a mixture of VFR and MVFR until we get to the eastern portions of the interior where more IFR conditions are expected. IFR also expected along the Arctic coastline. Friday afternoon, going to continue to see primarily IFR up along the Arctic coast, primarily VFR throughout the interior and south central Alaska, then to start to see more MVFR and IFR as we move down towards Bristol Bay, and then MVFR and IFR throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, as well as some MVFR for western portions of the Gulf, and then IFR for those northern and eastern locations, and starting to push some of those IFR flight conditions into the areas of the Panhandle nearest to the Gulf of Alaska with VFR conditions in the inside waters. 4-hour passes starting up north, AKwx should be MVFR throughout the day Thursday. Hattigan should also be MVFR on Thursday. Lake Clark and Merrill both expected to be marginal conditions, as well as at Rainy Pass and Windy Pass. So you get to Isabel Pass, going to start off marginal, but then improve to VFR in the afternoon. Mentasta should be VFR throughout the day on Thursday. Tanita should stay marginal all day, as well as at Portage, and then Chilkoot and White will both start off IFR and improve to marginal in the afternoon. As we look at our freezing levels, we can see that our surface freezing line has pushed through a lot of the eastern portions of mainland Alaska, especially at the higher elevations where we're seeing more snow in the mountains. We have an area of warmer air extending up towards the Kodiak Island area, extending the 4,000-foot freezing levels out over southwest Alaska, and then another area of warmer air by the southern portions of the Panhandle, with an area of 4,000 feet also over the southern portions of the Panhandle. Looking at our icing, with the multiple lows moving through the area, we have quite a bit of icing. Light icing out over much of the Bering Sea, and the showers moving through the area between 3,000 and 8,000 feet by the Aleutian Islands, between 4,000 and 9,000 feet as we get up closer towards St. Lawrence Island. Out over southwest Alaska, between 4,000 and 9,000 feet is expected, and then above 4,000 feet as we get into areas in and around the Gulf of Alaska. Also, some of the stratus up north along the Arctic coastline, going to see some areas of icing below 2,000 feet. Taking a look at our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is south of the Aleutians out of a west to northwest direction, 175 knots. Out over the Aleutians themselves, more around the 70 to 80 knot range. Out over the eastern and northeastern portion of the Bering Sea, southerly winds 50 knots, and then some south to southeast winds over the northwestern portion of the state, 50 knots there, 65 knots out of the north, out over the northeastern portion of the state, and then westerly winds up to as high as around 60 knots out over the Panhandle. Down to 9,000 feet, strongest winds are going to be around our low out over the Bering, up to as high as 45 to 55 knots out of a northwesterly direction for the Aleutians. Along the west coast, southerly winds up to as high as 45 knots, and then southerly winds 40 knots over south central Alaska. Down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians. West to northwest winds, 45 to 50 knots by the Aleutians. Then out over the south central area, especially through the Barren Islands area, 45 knots out of a south to southeast direction, 35 to 45 knots up much of the west coast, stronger by Kotzebue Sound, 25 knots for the interior out of that southeast direction, and then off the Arctic coastline, southeast winds at 35 knots as well. For our turbulence all throughout the Aleutian Islands into the Alaska Peninsula, below 3,000 feet out west, 4,000 feet for the east, then over the western mainland below 4,000 feet, below 6,000 for south central.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather, growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York. and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms, why they occurred. The distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region. The rain-snow line, all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense and what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses, are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. You know, there are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas, we have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. One of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, you know, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors. big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're driving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back from Marines. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We are seeing continued growth along the main ice pack, whereas north of AKwx we are seeing ice up to 40 nautical miles away, and down by Kaktovik down as low as 25 nautical miles away, with some of those areas sub 10% coverage even closer. As we look down in southeast Alaska on Thursday, in the inside waters, south to southeast winds 10 knots are expected. In eastern portions of the Gulf, southerly winds 15 to 20 knots, and then southeasterly winds 25 knots in the northern Gulf. As we look into Friday, things picking up out over the Gulf, gale force winds all throughout the Gulf of Alaska, eastern portions, southeast winds 35 knots, becoming easterly 35 knots as we move further to the north, with seas 15 to 18 feet all through that eastern and northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska. In the inside waters, northerly winds 15 knots in the Lynn Canal area, becoming northeasterly 15 as we move to central areas, and then southeast winds 20 knots in southern areas. Out over south central Alaska on Thursday, in the Gulf, southeasterly winds 25 to 35 knots in northern locations, easterly 35 knots as we get out by the Barren Islands area, and then easterly winds 40 knots on the west of the Barren Islands. Out in the Cook Inlet area, east to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots expected, and then in Prince William Sound, easterly winds at 25 knots, seas up to as high as 13 feet east of the Barren Islands. As we look into Friday, strongest winds are going to push off to the east, easterly winds 35 knots in northern portions of the Gulf, seas up to as high as 17 feet. Western portions of the Gulf, easterly winds 15 knots. West of the Barren Islands, we're going to see easterly winds 30 knots, and then in the Cook Inlet area, north to northeast winds 25 knots expected. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 25 knots. Out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, primarily in west to southwest flow, 15 to 30 knots on the Bering side, strongest to the west, 25 knots on the Pacific side, and then becoming south 20 east of Kodiak Island, and then in Shelikof Strait, westerly winds 25 knots expected. For Friday, flow becoming much more westerly throughout, 15 knots by Kodiak Island, picking up to as high as 25 knots south of the Alaska Peninsula, seas as high as 12 feet, also south of the peninsula. For Thursday, out over the Aleutian Islands, we're going to see westerly winds throughout all the areas, 30 knots for the eastern Aleutians, 35 to 40 knots for the central Aleutians, and 35 to 40 knots out over the western Aleutian Islands. Seas up to as high as 21 feet on the Bering side of the central Aleutians. On Friday, going to continue to see westerly winds out by the western Aleutians, 30 knots, central Aleutians 30 to 35, and 25 to 30 for the eastern Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast of the state, southerly winds for the southern locations, 20 to 25 knots by Nunavik Island, 15 knots by St. Matthew Island, 25 knots by the Pribilof Islands, and southeast winds 25 knots as you get by St. Lawrence Island and the Norton Sound. Looking into Friday along the west coast, starting up in Norton Sound area, easterly winds 20 knots, that's also for St. Lawrence Island. By the west coast by Nunavik Island, 15 knots out of a southerly direction. Southeast winds 20 knots by St. Matthew Island. Southwest winds 20 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Along the Arctic coastline on Thursday, easterly winds 30 knots expected, 25 to 30 down the west coast, and through Shelikof Strait area, southeast winds 25 knots. On Friday, easterly winds along the Arctic coastline 30 to 35 knots, dropping down to 20 to 25 knots down the west coast and through the Bering Strait area. Recap for our weather for tonight. We have our low pressure system out of the northern portion of the Bering starting to spin in place as the front has broken down and a new low has formed off of the old boundary by Kodiak Island. This is going to result in rain from the Bristol Bay area up all of the west coast to the Point Hope and Point Lay areas. We're going to see more rain showers throughout the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands, and throughout the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Southerly winds out over the Gulf of Alaska are going to bring rain throughout the North Gulf Coast with snow in the coastal ranges. And then high pressure out over the Panhandle area is going to result in fog forming overnight tonight. In the interior, going to be primarily dry until we get way out west, and we're going to see fog along the Arctic coastline. On Thursday, we're going to see more fog along the Arctic coastline, primarily dry in the interior with some snow showers in the Brooks Range. Then down the west coast from the Seward Peninsula through the Bristol Bay area, going to see more rain. Rain going to continue in showers out through the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. And our low pressure system remains by Kodiak Island, but its front starts to push further to the east, allowing rain to get into more of the Panhandle area. Central and northern locations of the Panhandle will see rain, as well as along the North Gulf Coast. Finally, on Friday, that front will push closer towards the Alaska Peninsula, bringing more rain throughout the peninsula, including southern locations. And we're going to see more rain along the North Gulf Coast and in low-lying areas of south central Alaska, rain around the Bristol Bay area and the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. However, much of the rest of the west coast and interior should stay dry. And then we're going to see continued fog along the Arctic coastline. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal, pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.